Today we're discussing one of the greatest mafia bosses in Russian history, a man known as Vyacheslav Ivankov, aka Yaponchik, or Little Japanese. His story is one of struggle and triumph, rising to the highest rungs of the Russian criminal hierarchy and ruling among the thief-in-law. Yaponchik's exploits throughout the wild times of 1990s Russia even took him to the West, where he made the Russian Mafia an international player. But ultimately, all of this would be stripped away when he met his tragic end. Our story begins in 1965, when young Yaponchik was arrested for pickpocketing. He was not only a failed circus gymnast, but also a jiu-jitsu enthusiast. It took a team of police to arrest him. Before long, he was given a false diagnosis of schizophrenia, and he was sent to a prison hospital. This was a very common thing in Russia, either intentionally in the case of criminals or as a punishment in the case of political dissidents. In the prison hospital, he could, for the first time, join the ranks of the many professional criminals of the Soviet Union. Though one might not believe it, the glorious Soviet Union had plenty of crime and corruption even back then. The highest rungs of the criminal caste in these days were the thief-in-law, boy v zakon, professional criminals who would neither take legal work, cooperate with authorities, and would avoid crimes seen as dishonorable, like robbing other criminals. In turn, they ran many prison yards, being allowed far greater freedom than a typical prisoner. They were even catered to on arrival, always being given the best bunk possible by the other inmates. But they would live a life of crime. It wasn't easy. It meant constant imprisonment, and they could never return to the straight path ever again. One of the greatest and most pure of the thieves was a man known as Basha Brilliant, and he spent some 35 years of his life behind bars without interruption. By the 1960s, however, things were starting to change. The Caucasian gangsters, namely Georgians, had different practices from the Slavic gangsters. Georgians allowed for the purchase of a thief-in-law title. The Georgians cared about money and familial ties far more than the Slavic gangsters did. Those who purchased their titles this way were called oranges. It was part of a growing trend. The older thief-in-laws who had come up in the gulag were dying off or being marginalized by a wave of younger, more money-hungry criminals. This was the atmosphere that Yaponchik entered upon being sent into the normal prison system in 1967. You see, Yaponchik had initially been happy staying in the prison psychiatric hospital setup, but by 1966 he was tired of staying there. When he was told that they were going to be continuing treatment for another year or so, he orchestrated an escape attempt, no doubt using his gymnastic skills or jiu-jitsu skills. For a time, he remained free. In fact, he even managed to go back to school and finish high school while on the run from the cops. It was perhaps a serious attempt to reform himself. Or not. It's hard to say. Eventually, however, he was recaptured. This time, he was sent to a normal prison yard. Whatever reform attempt he had been undergoing at this point had been stopped dead in its tracks. Now Yaponchik was heading full speed towards criminality, because he was going to meet someone very important behind bars, Gennady Kharkov, aka Mongol. As far as the thief-in-law go, Mongol was a visionary. He was a member of that young generation who saw how things were going alongside the Caucasian oranges, that crime was about money and not respect. And indeed, by the 1960s, deep economic corruption had become a ripe fruit left on the vine, just waiting for the criminals to pluck. There were speculators, those who resold government property for higher prices, the Tolkach who helped government enterprises negotiate to hit quotas, barter better deals between enterprises, and even fictitious workers called snowflakes. Since the early 1960s, corruption in the USSR began to grow and metastasize from what had already been there. By the 1970s, in the command economy, corruption would become a chronic problem. But because of Brezhnev and his successors, it would only be until the mid-1980s, when it was far too late, that reforms were attempted. Theft and fraud had become major parts of the Soviet economy, with top Brezhnev-era officials being implicated for corruption over the years. By the 1980s, under the direction of Andropov, a series of corruption scandals were unveiled, resulting in well over several thousand arrested and many more executed. No, not many more, no. Resulting in well over several thousand arrested and many executed. Like I said though, by the 1980s, when these criminal schemes were unveiled, it was already too late to save the Soviet economy. Back in the 1960s, it was Mongol who realized the potential of what would bloom into mass corruption. Mongol saw all of this and realized that the money that he had been stealing for was right in front of him. The people in the gray and black market all had tons of cash. The average citizen was cash poor. The authorities were too strong or too dangerous to rob. So you go after those who were living like criminals. Normally this would be a big no-no. But the gradual softening of rules with the thief in law, introduction of the oranges, and the low income of the average Soviet citizen meant that the thief in law, Mongol, couldn't help but rob them blind. Traditional thief in law to the very end. Pasha, brilliant, wasn't powerful enough to stop them on his own. And so the rules of the thief in law gradually got bent and changed. It was Mongol that gave Yaponchik his nickname, Little Japanese, and inducted him into his own gang upon his release. There were other criminals in this gang. Vladimir Baikov, aka Balda, who also pretended to have schizophrenia to avoid prosecution for minor crimes, just like Yaponchik. Viktor Anikeyev, aka Bitumen Man, who was a sadistic contract killer who enjoyed splashing hot asphalt on his targets. Lev Genkin, aka Siska, who was a pickpocket expert. Then last, but certainly not least, was a drug addict known only as Executioner, who enjoyed putting people in coffins to terrify them into giving up their cash. The domineering and physically adept Yaponchik fit in well with this gang of bandits, led by the gangster strategist Mongol. The gang would find great success and become legendary in the Russian underground in due time. Soon, they would find their first target. Moscow's Queen of Shashlik, Antonia Lomakina, was targeted by Mongol when he discovered that she was doing dirty deals in addition to her own private business. She was dragged into a car with Mongol and his men for 4 hours. They drove around Moscow with any number of untold indignities occurring while she was trapped there in the car with them. Eventually, she agreed to hand over her money and the gang drove to her home. However, when she got into the apartment, she began to scream for help. Mongol and his boys fled. She should have just handed over the cash. Now they were angry and determined. They came back 2 weeks later and captured her yet again. This time they drove her to a forest. She was forced to dig her own grave and was hung by a rope. She didn't fold. For hours, they tortured her there in the forest. In the end, she handed over everything. Her money, jewelry, fine clothes, even her furniture. They even had her signed up for an agreement to have her hand over 10% of her monthly income to them. Now the gang had started their crime spree and they were rolling in cash. Over 100 rich Soviets, all criminals, would be targeted and robbed and extorted by Mongol and his gang. From the beginning, Yaponchik proved his value. He stole a police ID badge from a drunken cop and then acquired a police uniform to assist in a robbery extortion scheme. None of their targets were going to resist now. Mongol was very impressed with Yaponchik. Yaponchik, as the story goes, was a friendly guy and people liked him, and Mongol was a generous boss, so the two got along well and quickly became friends. Another target, antique shop manager Vladimir Mirkin, made the mistake of laughing in Mongol's face when Mongol made the request to share the wealth. So, Mirkin was grabbed off the street and forced into a truck. They shoved Mirkin into a coffin and nailed it shut. Mirkin still refused to hand over any information about his money or his valuables. That's exactly when a cop appeared and demanded that the criminals stop what they were doing and that they open up the coffin. Instead of Mirkin finding freedom, instead there was a sound of a gun going off. Then, silence. From a crack in the coffin, Mirkin could see the body of a dead cop in the van. Now the criminals were talking about what to do with Mirkin. He was a witness, so the implication would be that he would be taken care of, just like the cop. Suddenly, Mirkin had a miraculous change of heart. He told them everything they wanted to know, even handing over a key to a safe in his apartment. At that moment, the dead cop hopped up and started laughing. It was Yaponchik in a stolen policeman's uniform. It had all been a trick the whole time. Mirkin was further extorted for 10,000 rubles and whatever Mirkin's sister had when she handed over the ransom. They had won themselves a king's ransom, and had gotten it easily. They kept doing this again and again, apparently almost 100 times over the course of one single year. Naturally, fellow criminals were jealous, and this only fueled criticism of Mongol for bending the rules on extorting criminals. This practice would later be known as racketeering, but in those days it was a new concept that Mongol helped formalize. It was easy to get money this way. They were rich, probably even by American standards at this point. Mongol and Yaponchik began to go twice weekly to the underground speakeasy Saturn, run by singer Mikhail Zvezdinsky. It was the only place in the whole of the Soviet Union outside of the bar at the international airport near Moscow that had an open bar past 11 p.m. And there the group hobnobbed with Moscow's elite. Actors, directors, pop stars, criminals, even the corrupt daughter of Brezhnev, Valina Brezhnev, and her husband, Yuri Cherbanov, frequented the establishment. Ironically, given that the entry fee was almost double the yearly salary in those days, it meant that their fellow patrons were also their potential targets. They were rolling in money in those days, but as much as they took in, they typically spent about that much. It meant that they needed more cash all the time to maintain the lavish lifestyle. More cash, more robberies, and more chances for things to go very wrong. And eventually, it would. One cold Moscow night, Yaponchik and a woman named Tatiana were in bed together. Tatiana complained about something that had happened to her. The middleman for her drug-dealing side job had screwed her out of money. Not only did she sell her body, she also sold grass. Mongol and his gang set their sights on the man, showing up at his apartment in full police regalia. After only a few minutes in the coffin, the middleman gave up what he had. 5,000 rubles, his illicit narcotics, and a stash of Tsarist-era gold. Not bad for a day's work. This idiot dealer apparently figured out that Tatiana was the one who ratted him out, so he went to her place to teach her a lesson. Guess who was there with Tatiana when the dealer arrived? So, now in the hands of Yaponchik for a second time, the dealer gave up the name of his supplier. This was an Uzbek woman named Fatima Bersanukayeva. She was a full-time dealer and likely was in the highest rung in a drug-dealing enterprise from the Central Asian republics of the USSR. It was inevitable that she kept plenty of product and cash at her home. So they pulled the same scheme on her. Mongol's fake police raided her and stole her cash and narcotics. They even had her give over an additional 10,000 rubles. A little while later, they used Tatiana to lure the woman out again and tortured her until she gave over everything she had. It was a big win for them, or would have been. You see, according to the story, Fatima was friends with a number of Georgian thief-in-laws. In fact, some of the narcotics they stole were for their fellow thief-in-laws' consumption, potentially. Intentionally or not, Mongol was now screwing with other gangsters. Between the bending of the rules and the Fatima case, it became too much. A meeting was called. Mongol was called to the basement of a Moscow cafe. There, Mongol and 12 other notable thief-in-law members were assembled, sitting there in the cold and musty darkness. The plan would have been obvious to him. In any normal situation, Mongol would have never made it out alive, but instead, Mongol descended the stairs wearing a policeman's uniform with a pair of pistols drawn, one in each hand. It would have been enough bullets for all of the other thief-in-laws assembled, and so they had to let him go. He was accused of violating the thief-in-law rules, and even cooperating with police. In that tense moment, Mongol shouted that the men had come to the meeting while high. Going to the meetings when not sober, you see, was a major faux pas in thief-in-law culture. And so Mongol excused himself, probably walking back up the stairs without turning his back to them. Depending on the source, what happened next changes. Some sources describe the old traditional thief-in-laws from that very meeting dropping a dime on Mongol and getting the police on him. Other sources say that a robbery of a pair of burglars resulted in them ratting on Mongol's gang when the police caught up with them later on. Either way, the police realized that there was a gang robbing people while dressed as cops. They immediately had an undercover get into Mongol's gang and confirm what was going on. Once they did, they launched a mass arrest. 27 people, including Mongol himself, were arrested in 1972. Yes, this whole section about Mongol and his gang occurred during a 1-year time frame. During that time, they had robbed around 100 people, stealing and spending entire fortunes many times over. Mongol was put under heavy pressure by the cops. If they came to understand the full extent of what he and his gang were doing, it would have easily been a death sentence for him. While no one had died, major crimes like this would often result in the death penalty in the Soviet Union. In the end, only a few cases were brought to trial. Mongol's money probably greased a few palms in the courtroom, and he got 14 years, close to the maximum sentence limit at that time in the Soviet Union. Mongol sat down and did his time. In prison, he had to deal with the other thief-in-law members on the yard, just narrowly avoiding a reprisal for all the rule-bending that he had done. In time, the thief-in-law community would accept Mongol's money-making schemes and it would become normal. At some point in the 1970s, he was formally crowned a thief-in-law behind bars, reportedly with one of the godfathers who crowned him being the arch-traditionalist Vasha Brilliant. For those 14 years, however, Mongol would need someone to look after his cash and see to managing what remained of his gang. So he settled on one trustworthy man, ordering immediately that everyone in his gang do everything they could to keep this one man from punishment. Yaponchik was this man. Of course, the good friend of Mongol, Yaponchik, gangster par excellence, made the perfect head of what remained of Mongol's gang. Yaponchik would continue to manage Mongol's personal stash and contribute to the common fund to keep money flowing inside. Yaponchik escaped without punishment. Now he was free, and it gave him time to assemble his new gang slow enough to keep the cops off of him. Some of these members were former Mongol men like Balda, who used their false schizophrenia diagnosis to get out of jail as fast as they got put in, and others, like future mob boss Otari Kvanchishvili, were added to the gang for the first time. Things moved slow at first, mostly because Yaponchik couldn't do much. During this time he got a legal job, bending the rules yet again, and he laid low, only occasionally robbing or extorting the rich when he identified good targets on his own. But that didn't mean that things were going to be smooth sailing for the hard-headed gangster. One night in 1974, Yaponchik and some of the other gangsters, including Goga Yarovansky, went partying at the high-end Rus restaurant in Moscow. Yaponchik, ever the womanizer, found a woman he liked in spite of being married himself, and so after a few dances, he invited her to his table. Unfortunately, a Georgian man, likely also a gangster, also took a liking to her. After she said no to the dance, the Georgian grew angry and rolled up some money before sticking it in the woman's hair, as if to imply that she was a prostitute. Yaponchik immediately got up and struck the Georgian in the mouth. The fight devolved into a full-on bar brawl, like something out of a movie, with chairs, plates, and fists flying everywhere. It was a full barroom brawl in the center of Moscow. However, the Georgians were getting the upper hand, so one of Yaponchik's friends pulled out a gun and fired twice into one of the Georgians. The Georgian fell down, barely alive. With the fighting now broken up by gun smoke, the workers at the restaurant called the police, who hauled all of them to Bertyrka prison in central Moscow. It was an awful place. Too hot in the summer, too cold in the winter, filled with political prisoners and all sorts of petty criminals. The prison had been built in the 18th century and was, I guess you'd call it rustic. There in the bowels of the decrepit, overcrowded prison, Yaponchik, one of the party participants, Goga Yarovansky, and another thief-in-law there, Valerian Kuchliora, aka Piso, held a thieves' meeting. At last, in 1974, just under a decade since starting his criminal career, Yaponchik was crowned a thief-in-law. It was both a testament to his bravery and his evil that Yaponchik was able to be crowned so quickly and seemingly so easily in the Slavic tradition. He never bought his title like an orange. He made his bones with numerous violent acts. Now he was a hardened criminal, a true thief-in-law. The only thing that was certain in the life of a thief-in-law was death. You could fight it, you could try to avoid it, you could even accept it and let the Lord take you, but death would come for you all the same. It hung around you like a dark cloud. There was no way to escape it once you had been crowned. If you wanted to retire from being a thief-in-law, you would have to just become ready and take death as it came to you. As they say, the Lord takes the willing. After a few months, Yaponchik paid yet another bribe and received yet another diagnosis. Now he wasn't just schizophrenic, he was a disabled schizophrenic. He even got a card for it and everything. Things were a lot better in mental hospitals than prisons in the Soviet Union. Even in thief-in-law controlled yards, guards could still humiliate or abuse prisoners, and constant bribes were necessary. In the end, the string of crimes associated to Mongol and Yaponchik would be proven as just the latest in a wave of crimes to hit the Soviet capital of Moscow. Yaponchik escaped every time with minor punishments at worst, and had openly claimed that it was he who ran the city rather than the cops. So the top brass in the Moscow police gave the order to put Yaponchik behind bars no matter what. With Mongol protecting Yaponchik at the time, their only shot to get him locked up was this bar fight, and they had no luck. The Georgian who had been shot in the Rus restaurant brawl, believe it or not, being a gangster himself, lived by the principles set forth by the thieves before him. He wouldn't take the stand for the authorities, nor would any of his friends or Yaponchik's. Miraculously, in the end, no one was charged for the restaurant fight. Somehow. Not even the workers at the restaurant or other patrons would go on the record against Yaponchik. Yaponchik continued his robbing and criminal nonsense. This was the one man who never learned a single thing. A year later, quite literally months after its release, Yaponchik got into another bit of trouble. His second wife, who he never legally married, Lena Nikiforov, ran a pub and a brothel racket on the side. In a deal brokered by a friend of theirs, they would bring the money to someone selling a car for Yaponchik to buy. The deal ended up falling through, and the friend said that they had returned the money to Kalina. Yaponchik claimed that they hadn't. He demanded repayment with interest to be handed over at the Soviet Army Theater in the center of Moscow immediately. Yaponchik drove off to the theater. The police didn't stop him given that they knew it was Yaponchik's car, but they decided to follow and set up an ambush. They weren't totally sure of what he was doing, but they knew he was up to no good, and that they had to grab him as soon as they could. The Soviet Army Theater was just north of the center of Moscow, the nexus of the center of Soviet power. It was even on a large exchange for many important roads in Moscow. This had the makings of a major incident. Yaponchik was an angered career criminal, probably armed, and he was driving at high speeds directly to a Moscow landmark. There was no way this ended well. In front of the Soviet Army Theater, the debtor waited for Yaponchik. As the story goes, and who knows how reliable this is, Yaponchik rushed to the debtor's car and tossed the man aside into the passenger seat, seemingly being unaware of the police ambush. He took off in the debtor's car and the cops sprung into action. What happened next is of some debate. No one is sure who, but somebody started to shoot. The car drove away at top speeds and was recovered further away. Yaponchik had escaped. All of this happened in front of a Romanian government delegation, by the way. His criminal friends all wrote letters to the top authorities, saying that Yaponchik had been shot at by the police. Trying to kill a cop was a serious offense, one that could end up with him getting the death penalty, so. According to some sources, Yaponchik shot himself after this, to simulate the police having shot him, or was potentially actually shot by the police. Either way, Yaponchik was in and out of confinement in the 1970s, usually freed on account of supposed mental illness or a witness being uncooperative. In 1981, he embarked on yet another venture, this time finding a postage stamp collector who seemed to be a good target. One day, Yaponchik was approached by a man that said the stamp collector had stolen antique icons of some value from him. At first, Yaponchik wasn't interested, but when Yaponchik discovered that the stamp collector was also involved in illegal currency trading, he went all in. Under the guise of being a fellow stamp collector himself, the collector was enticed to a safe house. As soon as the door slammed shut, the torture began. Yaponchik attacked the stamp collector and handcuffed him to a radiator in the bathroom. He beat the collector and demanded 100,000 rubles from him for the trouble, an incredible sum of money. However, even after an extreme beating, The collector remained firm. It was only after the gang began to pour acid into the bathtub and promised to toss the collector in it that he reconsidered his position. He agreed to fork over the cash, promising to come up with an insane number that Yaponchik and his gang demanded. Unfortunately for Yaponchik, the authorities had been watching his activities and had somehow heard of his recent caper. They approached the collector and demanded that he testify against Yaponchik. Under the threat of being charged with crimes relating to currency trading and being fired from his job, the collector complied. A few days later, Yaponchik was ambushed by the police and arrested. This time he wasn't getting out of it. His cash couldn't grease any wheels, his top-class lawyer couldn't get him a win, and the nut house wasn't going to let him in. They gave him 14 years for the crime. Even staring down close to a max sentence in the Soviet prison system, Yaponchik refused to give up any details to the police when offered time off for cooperation. Yaponchik asked his fellow gang member and future major player in the underground of Moscow, Otarik Fanchishvili, to watch over his children, Eduard Ivankov aka Edo, as well as his second son who never entered a life of crime, and his informally adopted son, Viktor Nikiforov aka Kalina, seemingly nicknamed after his mother. During his trial and transfer out to the Far East, Yaponchik had grown ill in the poor conditions. When he arrived at the freezing prison in Magdan, he was in a bad way. His new cellmate saw the weakened Yaponchik and took the opportunity granted to him. It wasn't every day that you got to beat up a thief-in-law, after all. Attacking a thief-in-law is a horrible mistake to make, in case you hadn't already figured that out. If you were going to go after him, you had to get rid of him and hoped none of his buddies tried to take revenge. For a few days, the cellmate beat Yaponchik until Yaponchik was able to get removed and sent to a different cell using his connections. Then he discovered that the former cellmate worked in the prison sewing shop. It took some time in this freezing jail in the Far East, but eventually he was able to recover from his illness and his wounds. Once Yaponchik was feeling healthy, he made an odd request to the guards. Despite being a thief-in-law, he wanted to transfer to the prison sewing shop. He had turned over a new leaf. At last, Yaponchik had reformed. On his first day at his new work assignment, Yaponchik saw the man at the sewing shop. He picked up a pair of tailor scissors and stabbed the man in the eye. I mean, are you really surprised? I'm not. Not really. Because of this and other incidents, they packed him up. He would be going somewhere else, somewhere much more horrifying than he had been before. It was a place that was designed to break him. It was called Tulun Prison, and it was made for destroying thief-in-law. Tulun Prison was based out of Chili, Irkutsk, made back in the early 1920s, when Count von Ungern Sternberg and the other White Guard stragglers were running around. At first, it was just a wooden building and was heated by wood-burning stoves. By the 1930s, the prison was used as a temporary storage center for NKVD victims during the Great Purge before they were, erased. Starting in 1962, the prison was reconstructed, transformed from wood into concrete, and given heating. Ooh, fancy. This was because Tulun and several other prisons, like Black Dolphin, were selected for a new program to deal with the Soviet prison system's problem inmates. In effect, these prisons were intended to be a place that would destroy thief-in-law. Tulun featured all of the humiliation and abuse not only dished out by guards, but with the added benefit of even worse treatment. In fact, they would even have prisoners run the gauntlet, the local OMON, that's the Soviet SWAT, and they would beat the prisoners with nightsticks as they passed by them. Just a few years prior, Tulun Prison had been the site of a prison riot that reportedly led to 5 of the organizers of the riot being executed. It was not a nice place to be. Taken out of the prison van, Yaponchik and several other inmates were shuffled in and given the dressing down that each prisoner gets when they arrive at a new institution. On the wall, when he entered, he would also see the portrait of the new General Secretary Andropov, with an old acquaintance from the underground Saturn Club beside him, Yuri Cherbanov, husband of Galina Brezhnev and new Ministry of Internal Affairs prison boss. I wonder if he thought back to those old days at Saturn with Mongol when he saw the picture. Either way, he was stuck in this mess and was not going to be able to leave. 14 years starting from then. He was going to be subjected to random beatings and abuse. He and the other most dangerous prisoners lived on the 4th floor of the structure. There, most of the thief-in-laws and garden variety gangsters were Georgians. Yaponchik was no racist when it came to the Georgians, and he didn't mind them. They were all in the thief-in-law life together. In particular, Yaponchik served time with Dato Tashkensky, a Georgian mob heavyweight. Dato had worked to recrown another pal of Yaponchik's, Ded Hassan, aka Grandpa Hassan, who was actively involved in organizing the criminals there in a sort of thief-in-law university to both train criminals and also break down the authorities' control of Toulon. So naturally the pair got along quite well and became friends, friendly enough to share a cell at least. Yaponchik was the legendary muscle, and Dato was charismatic and powerful enough to control a man with just his words. It was a good pairing that helped soften Toulon's strictness significantly over the course of the 80s. In between punishments for a laundry list of incidents, Yaponchik managed to crown 7 thieves behind the walls of Toulon prison. The most notable among these were the 2 best friends, Andrei Isayov, aka Rospis, or Painting, given his large collection of tattoos, and Alexei Petrov, aka Petrik. The pair were supposedly like blood brothers and became some of Yaponchik's chief men. Earlier, before he was sent to Toulon, Yaponchik had met the son of a party member turned gangster from Gomel, Alexander Timoshenko. Yaponchik looked past Timoshenko's dishonorable charge from Timoshenko's first arrest. The charge was rape, by the way, and so he took Timoshenko under his wing, with Timoshenko becoming Yaponchik's right-hand man for his later foreign ventures. Timoshenko sought to leave the Soviet Union, even going as far to pretend to be Jewish to be allowed to immigrate. By the mid-1980s, he had managed to get abroad and begin making friendships with fellow Gomel native and heroin smuggler, Brighton Beach bigwig Boris Nayfield. However, not everyone took to Yaponchik for his often bullying ways of the other prisoners. One of the few men who had the pride or the ignorance to challenge Yaponchik's stature as a thief-in-law, Ilya Simonia, aka Makho, picked a fight with Yaponchik. The exact details of the fight are unknown, and it's highly likely that Yaponchik won. Later on, Yaponchik's ally Ded Hassan, Grandpa Hassan, uncrowned Makho for his fight with Yaponchik. It would seem like a total Yaponchik win. However, Makho was tied in close to the highly ambitious Georgian gangster Tariel Oniani, aka Taro. Taro was so offended by this whole situation that he lost faith in the thief-in-law of Russia, so he left for France to make his fortune abroad once he got the chance to. This is something in the storytelling business that we call foreshadowing. By the late 1980s, the thief-breaker prison at Toulon had been totally compromised by the criminals. And what was stranger, Yaponchik, a man who was never a good friend of the rich or famous or activists, had become the focus of a campaign for his release. Though his second wife was supposedly the head of this campaign, the campaign received the help of numerous high-level Russian celebrities and activists. In 1990, they had even sent letters to the Soviet government. This somehow even reached the desk of Yeltsin, though naturally, Yeltsin had more important things to do in the years 1990 and 1991. This campaign was likely a targeted release for the sake of countering the growing influence of Georgian gangsters in the capital. In those days, the police often tried to work with a growing number of gangsters rather than put them behind bars. Ultimately, the courts agreed to reduce his sentence to 10 years with an expected release date for 1992. Somehow, he was able to get released a year earlier in 1991. Yaponchik had been put behind bars in the closing days of Brezhnev and in his era of stagnation. Though things were corrupt, it must have been an incredible shock for him to go from the 1980s to suddenly 1990s Russia, where the economy is run by criminals and the whole thing is collapsing. Compared to just about everybody else, Yaponchik and the other thief-in-laws were best prepared for this new Russia. If you were ready to use violence and underhanded tricks, you could make bank in this new environment and become a new Russian. Too much money, no sense, no morals. This was the new ruling class of Russia. The rulers had changed, but let's be honest, the theft was just more honest now. But for Yaponchik, this wasn't going to be smooth sailing. The potential was there. Grease the cops and the courts with money or connections. Shoot your rivals to control rackets. You could even take control of Moscow or maybe even Russia itself. Though everyone else also had that idea as well. Well, everybody had guns, everybody had money to grease the wheels, everybody had the desire to jump out and go to jail for a few bucks. People were starving, and the value placed on life in Russia somehow got even lower than in the Soviet era. Yaponchik and the old thief-in-law clique had grown up and become aged men behind bars. Tons of young men, men in their prime, were on the come-up, and would end up leading major gangs. People like Yaponchik's heavily tattooed godson Rospis, or Sergei Timofeev, aka Sylvester. These guys who I just named, as much as they were all close to Yaponchik, were all leading their own groups. They all wanted to be the boss. This was a recipe for a bloodbath that would unfold on Russia's streets. By 1997, Rospis, Sylvester, Mongol, and his adopted son Kalina, Otarik Fanchishvili, and many, many others had died, with the exception of Mongol, all violently. Upon his release, Yaponchik assessed the situation and decided that he needed to meet with many of his old thief-in-law pals. By November of 1991, he had called a thieves' meeting of the top gangsters of Russia in the Metropole 5-star hotel in Moscow. This was supposed to be a celebration of his release, but in truth it was a meeting to discuss the present situation. Yaponchik was more or less recognized as the head of the Slavic thief-in-law, even though he was not a major gang boss in terms of sheer numbers. He kept good relations with pretty much everybody, especially the Caucasians, but people were really chomping at the bit to kill each other in these days. No firm strategy was decided for the thief-in-law. That would be impossible. It was every man for themselves, more or less. At around this time, Yaponchik made a huge mistake, however. At a restaurant, Yaponchik and another mobster waited to get served at a coat room. However, 3 Turkish businessmen were in front of them. Enraged by this sight, Yaponchik and the other mobster pulled out a gun and killed 2 of the businessmen, left the other for dead. This was a brazen, flagrant double murder. Witnesses were left alive. It was a real shit show. While he was able to get away with it initially, staying in Russia would be dangerous. He would have to go underground or flee the country. So, in short, he messed up whatever chance he had to succeed in Russia as a gangster, at least for the time being. I suppose you can say that a move abroad dovetailed quite nicely with the recent developments. But it's important to note that this move abroad was a planned thing, something that he'd been thinking about for quite some time. Also, do you remember Alexander Timoshenko, the mobster who went abroad? He got settled in the West and began to make connections, chiefly in Germany and the US, and making friends with fellow Gomel native and major drug smuggler Boris Nayfield. This gave Timoshenko and Yaponchik an in at Brighton Beach, but not Germany. Germany, you see, was under the control of a mobster named Efim Laskin, who was represented in Brighton Beach by Monya Elson. The pair of men had entered a war with Boris Nayfield, putting Timoshenko and, by extension, Yaponchik at war with the men as well. Efim Laskin had been firmly in charge of Russian organized crime in Germany dating back to the early 1970s. This is in spite of the fact that he wasn't really even a thief-in-law, just some regular gangster. He had no clue how much this angered the thief-in-law back home. By the time the Berlin Wall fell, he was on the outs. But Laskin didn't realize it. Laskin was quickly marked for death, likely on the orders of Yaponchik himself. One September day, 2 months before the thieves' meeting in Moscow, Laskin was heading for a swim at the I can't pronounce that shit. He parked the car, and as he got out, a man rushed up to him. Laskin was stabbed 11 times by the attacker and passed away at the scene. Though the attacker was wearing a wig, in the late 1990s, DNA would identify the attacker as none other than Alexander Timoshenko. Laskin had passed on to the next life, and Elson was behind bars for his attacks on Nayfield's men. Now the chessboard had been cleared for Yaponchik to go ahead to the US. It's at this point in the story that I have to remind you that the sources for this are somewhat of mixed value. It's the result of me piecing together journalism, various watchdog organizations, information, international organizations, and Russian gangster websites. So, this is my way of saying that what I describe from here on out is the result of me trying to string together and create a narrative of what Yaponchik may, or may not, have been a part of. Please keep that in mind. This is all alleged. Yaponchik famously had strong opinions on the press and called them disinformation peddlers, so I can't imagine that he would have good opinions about me regardless on how I describe his business enterprises in the US. To Robert I. Friedman from Vyacheslav Ivankov. Friedman, you are a dirty fucking American prostitution liar. I will fuck you, and I will make you suck my Russian dick. Ivankov. 4/29/93. So yeah, he wouldn't have been a happy camper. Yaponchik got a fake job with a movie studio called 12A, ran by noted director Roland Bykov, working on a venture in the US called Priority. Despite being a career criminal, when Yaponchik asked for a visa to visit the US, the Russian government never handed over any information indicating Yaponchik's criminal status. Russia just let the wolf into the henhouse. When Yaponchik arrived in the US, 12A's Priority project was immediately terminated. Right after this, he entered a fake marriage with a woman. Now, he never had to go home. Yaponchik was free in the land of opportunity. He had connections in Miami, Berlin, Vienna, and even bought property out in Colorado. But his home was always Brighton Beach in Brooklyn. At first reportedly living in the home of a producer, likely the producer of immigrant singer Vili Tokarev. Tokarev would grow to become a good friend of Yaponchik and would rely on Yaponchik to keep the Italian-American Mafia off his case. Among his initial crew in the US was Boris Nayfield, who primarily helped bring Yaponchik into the drug game, Alexander Timoshenko, who was Yaponchik's right-hand man there in the US, another gang leader who was often close to Timoshenko named Alik Magadan, and a group of ex-Soviet businessmen that we'll discuss in just a moment. So, what was Yaponchik doing in the US? The main thing that he was doing was likely looking after cash and other rackets in the US. This practice is sometimes called a roofing. Sometimes this takes the form of a protection racket, and other times it's just watching over money or rackets. In the case of Yaponchik, it likely involved a lot of money laundering. But extortion, that old beloved racket of Yaponchik, was always going to be on the menu. There are plenty of Russians living in the northeastern US to shake down and threaten. But this time the point man wasn't Yaponchik, but his right-hand man Timoshenko. The exact nature of these exploits are unknown, by the way. Regardless, Timoshenko quickly got incredibly wealthy, wearing fur coats and living out in Long Island where the Big Noses, Italian Mafia, were known to have estates. According to none other than the BBC, Timoshenko's main contact with the Big Noses was Black Dom Dionisio, a half-black member of the Genovese family who reportedly became a made man quite recently. So congrats on breaking the Mafia color barrier, I guess, Dom. Beyond boiler room penny stock trading scams, the one thing that Timoshenko can get his name really attached to is regarding the boxer Oleg Koroteyev. Koroteyev was a talented boxer with an astounding 187 wins under his belt, but he'd ran afoul of someone in charge, so they set him up and slapped him with charges. A common story in the Soviet Union. He ended up drifting into the criminal world before eventually immigrating to the US. He had close ties with Otarik Franchishvili and Yaponchik himself. However, he somehow pissed somebody off, we don't know who. As he was leaving a restaurant, Koroteyev was gunned down. No one knows why. But it's been ascertained that the one doing the shooting was Alik Magadan, the other gangster close to Timoshenko, who shot the boxer. Some people have stated that the FSB potentially had a hand in some of their activities in the US, but there's no proof of that. Then there's also the matter, more specifically, of the NHL. During the Cold War, some of the best hockey players in the world resided in the Soviet Union, where they were technically not professionals. The Soviets rarely allowed them to leave the country to play abroad in foreign leagues. The idea was insane to them. Part of the Soviet Union's propaganda was how good their ice hockey teams were, so if they let them go abroad, they would lose out on a player, potentially permanently, given how high NHL salaries were compared to the peanuts they made back home. In terms of sheer living standards, the USSR could never compete with the West. It was 1982 when Viktor Nechayev was first given permission by the Soviet government to play in the NHL. Then in 1988, Alexander Mogilny defected after the 1989 World Ice Hockey Championships, joining the Buffalo Sabres. Mogilny's defection signaled the tsunami of Soviet talent that would follow him. Soon the Soviets were having hockey players defect on a regular basis from Soviet teams to the NHL, with the Detroit Red Wings actually assisting in several of these defections. Sergei Fedorov, Pavel Bure, Slava Kozlov, Slava Fetisov, and many others soon joined the NHL. And with the collapse of the USSR in 1991, there was nothing left to stop top Russian hockey talent from playing in the NHL. It's a free country. Things were going well, but you see, with their NHL salaries, they had become targets. About half a dozen players during the early 1990s were targeted by extortionists. One of the more shocking examples is that of Oleg Tverzdovsky of Ukraine. Tverzdovsky's mother was kidnapped from her Donetsk apartment one day. Soon word got out to him that a shadowy criminal organization demanded $200,000 to obtain his mother's release. It was an incredible sum back then, and for Donetsk even more so, and even now. But given that he was an NHL player, he would be able to get them, their cash. Ultimately, after 11 days, his mother was released, and supposedly the men behind the kidnapping were dealt with by the authorities. Supposedly. Even Alexander Mogilny was targeted.
Alexander Mogilny was noticeably absent from the Sabres lineup last night, and for good reason. A former Russian business associate who helped Mogilny defect to the U.S. threatened to end his career yesterday. Erie County Sheriff and Amherst police officials say 30-year-old Sergei Pavlovsky followed Mogilny from practice to this Amherst restaurant where he attempted to extort money from Mogilny.
He asked him for $150,000 and told him that if he didn't give him the money, that he was going to shoot him or stab him in his legs.
Clearly, if you were an Eastern European in the NHL, you needed to bring your family to the West, or you needed a roof to protect you. Ironically, by doing legit business in the West meant that they needed a roof to protect them in the East, like they were doing criminal work. Pavel Bure was one of the first players recognized as having taken deals with Russian mobsters. In 1993, it was reported that he had been extorted, but eventually he was shown to be a pal of Otari Franchishvili. Another player, Slava Fetisov, was actually directly connected to a Brooklyn-based company called Slavic Inc. This company was owned by Yaponchik. A PBS investigation in the late 1990s went into deep depth into how the Russian Mafia had infiltrated the NHL, with Slava Fetisov giving his take on his connections with Yaponchik and Slavic Inc. And you're not the only one who's been singled out. I mean, Pavel Bure, Kamensky, all have been sort of questioned about associations with businessmen. What's behind that? You can talk to the people until you know they do something wrong, but you can't judge the people by somebody's opinion. Definitely have to be careful what's going on. Why don't you guys speak out more often? When somebody questions, for example, there's this one association that gets you very upset every time it comes up, and that's your involvement in this company called Slavic Incorporated. And why, why do you get angry? I get angry? Yeah, I get angry. I got nothing to hide. And like I said, everything here, you can't hide anything. I never was angry, but people call me to get interview, and they ask questions. I got nothing to do with this situation. And then they try to throw names and, the facts and all this stuff. And I try to say I got nothing to do with the situation. I never get angry. I said if you want to talk about something else, I can talk. But why do you deny the association with Slavic? What association? It's not... You were, a signing officer. I'm denying that. What was your understanding of the business for Slavic? What do you think Slavic was in the business for? It was trading. A trading company. Yes. And it's not in business now, No, I never did any business. I was playing hockey all my life. My school friend who was in business, and I trust this man, I know him for more than 20 years. And listen, it's what was very popular at those times to get kind of joint venture things. I mean, you meet somebody from this side, you meet somebody from another side, and it's a good company. never do anything wrong. The truth was that a lot of people were perfectly happy to let the Russian Mafia set up shop here in the US, if it meant that they could keep their head in the sand and make money. Meanwhile, investigations by journalists would only come after major legal action had already occurred. But there's seemingly no concrete information about payments to Yaponchik, or fixing matches or anything like that. Yaponchik was also likely involved in drug smuggling to some degree, given his connections to Boris Neifeld. However, Boris Neifeld went down in 1994, so he only had about 2 years of activity there, if any at all. Yaponchik also had major investments, if you could call them that, of about 80% of a shipbuilding company and a gold mining company in the Far East. That's the Far East of Russia, not the US, mind you. From an apartment building at 6A Neptune Avenue in Brooklyn, Yaponchik's Slavic Inc. was the center of an operation that helped oversee his criminal empire, even sending funds to the Mogilevich-associated Solntsevo gang. However, the operation was also tied in with the rival Ishmailovo gang. Paratrooper turned gangster Anton Malevsky, who had close ties to the Russian security services and many Afghan war veterans, was growing fast as a gangster and eagerly worked with Yaponchik. Now, regarding the business connections, I have to say something before we continue. Once again, I feel the need to mention that these are all things that allegedly happened. There's a lot of reporting on this already, and I'll be sticking to solely established sources. However, I must say that all of this is alleged. Since some of these individuals are billionaires and appear to be litigious, I won't be naming certain people in this section. Goodbye, kitty. You wanna go? Come on. You wanna go? Bye-bye. Let's start talking about the Aluminum Wars. Now, while I wasn't aware of this before I researched the video, but in 1990s Russia, you could rent factories out through a process called toiling. This would allow you to essentially rent factories, and so you would have the factory, the workers, and all that stuff rented, and you could import raw materials, process them at the factory, and export. And importing and exporting, at that point, you wouldn't actually pay tax, so as a result, you would get the finished products tax-free. This was a very serious financial boon for the economy of Russia, which at that point had many enterprises that had basically failed. They were failed or failing, and they were all mired in debt. And as a result, they needed foreign capital. The foreign capital would see this great deal where there was no taxes. There literally was no taxes. You would just rent the factory, and you get none of the overhead, none of the other problems. Just have to have a lot of money laying around, and you could get tax-free products. So Russia got lots and lots of foreign money this way, and in return the foreign businessmen would get lots of access to Russia's large industrial base, and material resources opened up to them for pennies on the dollar. They were not paying a lot of money for what they probably should have. Naturally, this led to a lot of corruption and ultimately violence. In the aluminum market, there were two primary competitors with many small-time crooks, like Anatoly Baikov, who was a mobbed-up businessman influential in the Krasnoyarsk region, right in the heart of the contested area. However, we're focusing on a single enterprise here known as Transworld, or Transworld Commodities. Who started Transworld and Transworld Commodities depends on who's telling the story. Sometimes this is said to have been businessman Sam Kislin, or a pair of brother businessmen from the UK. Either way, all three were in on it. Kislin was, according to the FBI, thoroughly mobbed up and associated with Yaponchik. For many years, he and his business partner, Tamir Sapir, had operated an electronics store, serving Soviet businessmen who came in to purchase foreign electronics for themselves, alongside their typical customer base in New York City. The pair eventually worked to export products to the USSR, and Sapir managed to get licenses to export Soviet oil to the US. A very lucrative deal. Kislin, however, managed to get things set up with none other than Donald Trump. When Trump was setting up a new hotel back in the 1970s, Kislin gave him 200 televisions on credit. Since then, the pair had built a strong relationship, with Kislin claiming that he had actually convinced Donald Trump that the Ukrainian government was corrupt, among many other things. Kislin also had connections to Babek Sarush, a man who was charged with exporting missile systems to North Korea in the 1980s, which is insane, but not connected to this story. It's important to note, however, there was no proof that Sapir or his son had any involvement in the deals that Kislin was involved in terms of Transworld or Russia. However, they are related to the building of the Trump Soho building, being the primary financiers behind the venture alongside Bayrock Group. Many apartments in the Trump Soho were noted to have been bought and sold by shell companies with ties to Central Asian corrupt politicians and gangsters. The owner of Bayrock Group, Tevfik Arif, was reportedly working for Transworld during these times, according to Russian reporting from the early 2000s. If Arif was working for Transworld, he was just one man out of many on the ground there. On the western side, far away from Russia, they had the money and the knowledge to set up and exploit the opportunity, but they needed agents on the ground to keep things in order there and eliminate competition. And I do mean eliminate. All these crimes were never solved and there's no proof of any orders. Multiple people died over the aluminum smelter at Krasnoyarsk, Russia's second largest aluminum smelter. Regardless, I won't go into much detail as it doesn't concern Yaponchik directly. These field agents were gathered up one way or another by middlemen, another pair of brothers, gangsters originally from Uzbekistan, the Cherny brothers. There has been much said about the Cherny brothers, but I'll make it short. Here's a photo of Michael Cherny. Here's a photo of Izmailovo gang heavyweight Yaponchik. Here's some of his gang. Now here's Yaponchik and Yeltsin's tennis coach Tarpishchev. Through the Izmailovo mob and the Cherny brothers, Transworld received both gangsters and connections to influence peddlers who would provide roofing, similar to what Yaponchik was doing. At the center of the scheme was Oleg Soskovets, who was at the time very close to Yeltsin. Soskovets was at the center of a group, along with Tarpishchev, inside the Yeltsin orbit. Yeltsin was a temperamental man who kept odd, ambitious people near him who peddled influence from their posts. During the early 90s, Transworld made upwards of $400 million, by the way, so it was a huge scheme. It was big money and a lot of it needed to be sent to different places. Certain people needed a cut, Yaponchik likely included. As part of the money laundering, according to a Fortune article that the two British brothers sued over, they sent money to the Bank of New York City, now the Bank of New York City Mellon. Before it was transferred over to its new ownership, the Bank of New York City was the site of a massive money laundering enterprise. Ultimately, it was forced to pay some $38 million to settle a pair of criminal investigations and was sued by the Russian government in 2007. Money also ended up in the hands of YBM Magnex, based in Pennsylvania. This was actually a fraudulent company ran by none other than Semion Mogilevich. Mogilevich and the Solnitsovo mob weren't always in the good graces of the Izmailovo Mafia, but it appears that some sort of deal had been struck between the two groups. There are even some statements that seem to imply that Transworld money ended up being involved in Kremlingate, a scandal that threatened Putin and Yeltsin with corruption charges. But that was in the late 1990s. You see, Yaponchik was about to have his luck run out back in 1995. This all descends from Yaponchik getting involved in his old standard, extortion. Yaponchik was brave and knew how to set up a robbery or extortion, but he wasn't very good at avoiding getting caught. It was only the extreme corruption and downright garbage skills of the late Soviet justice system that allowed Yaponchik to flourish as he had. Doing the same in the US would come to be a huge mistake. This brings us to Farah Bank. Farah Bank was established in 1992 by Marina Frantseva and Vladimir Rachuk, despite not having a banking license. But the pair got off to a good start. Maria's father was a famous doctor, and Rachuk's father was a film critic. So between the high interest rates promised and their huge list of celebrity clients, Farah Bank grew fast. But for every ruble put into the bank, most of it was hoovered up and sent somewhere else. This was because it was a huge scam that was developing into an outright pyramid scheme. There were many such schemes during this period, Tibet, MMM, and so on. Soon they had some 70,000 victims to their scam, and the couple lived a wealthy life, far more wild and extravagant than many even wealthy Americans would have even dreamed of. But this lifestyle didn't last long. Between Rodchuk and his wife Marina and the other fraudsters who had joined Chara Bank, just 2 years after starting the bank in 1994, the money had ran out and the scheme was collapsing. By 1996, they owed 130 billion rubles, and the scheme had become totally non-functional. It was over, and even the highly corrupt Russian authorities were going to crack down on them. Shortly thereafter, Rodchuk died in his bathtub. Who knows why? So the scheme collapsed and Rodchuk was dead, and his wife Marina went underground soon after. She would actually end up escaping any punishment from the courts, by the way. Criminal elements worked hard to get their hands on whatever remained of the Chara Bank nest egg. Before his death, Rodchuk had invested some $2.7 million in the US-based investment company Summit International. The 2 directors of the company were Russian immigrants and were certainly not interested in paying Yaponchik what they owed to the former Rodchuk, especially given that he was dead. Though Yaponchik didn't even ask for $2.5 million, he instead demanded reportedly, at least initially, $3.5 million. Why do you ask? Because he was an asshole. Knowing that the US didn't appreciate organized crime, the 2 directors of the investment company reached out to the FBI. What followed was a 6-month surveillance campaign by the FBI to crush Yaponchik and his criminal network in the US. The feds watched him around the clock, putting almost 20 FBI agents on the case in 3 shifts to monitor his phone calls and watch his movements. Once the time came, Yaponchik and the 5 others were easily arrested for extortion. In his possession when he was arrested was a .38 pistol, multiple passports with false names, and thousands of dollars laying around his home. In addition to extortion, Yaponchik was charged in relation to his fraudulent marriage to a former background singer of Veli Tokarev that allowed him to stay in the US. The story that top money lawyers came up with was that Yaponchik was just a nice guy, a Robin Hood if you will, who wanted to help get the money back to the people who got swindled by Chara Bank. Naturally, no one believed it. Yaponchik got a little under 10 years behind bars for his crimes. It was a major shakeup for the Russian Mafia in the US, and probably left Alexander Timoshenko as the top free man to permanently be based in the US. But Timoshenko would end up getting caught up in a penny stock scam akin to the Wolf of Wall Street, and would end up fleeing to the east not long after Yaponchik's imprisonment. With that, the Russian Mafia's influence in the US had been effectively wiped out. Now the US was just a location to launder money, not try to commit crimes as brazen as they did back home. There were also other major changes in Russia at around this time. When Yeltsin presidential campaign staffers were caught carrying out boxes from the campaign HQ filled with cash, the Xerox affair unfolded. Well, ultimately, Yeltsin easily survived, but Oleg Soskovets was soon removed. And so was Yeltsin's old tennis coach and Minister of Sport, Tokbyshev. And so the inner circle around Yeltsin that had been protecting Transworld in Russia had been neutralized and isolated. Most of these alienated figures would swing their support to Russian General Alexander Lebed, who they expected to run for president in 2000. Between Yaponchik's arrest and the removal of their roof, this likely caused a serious escalation in the breakdown between Transworld and the Solnitsevo Mafia. To protect their ally, in 1994, Transworld tried to bring the Ishmailovo Mafia boss, Anton Malevetsky, to the US via Kislin's nephew's company, Blonde Management. Instead, Malevetsky ended up in Israel, where he and one of the Cherny brothers were subject to an assassination attempt by 2 former cops. By the way, Malevetsky ended up moving to South Africa, and in 2001 was maybe thrown out of a plane. Transworld left the Russian market not long after that, though they made a brief return in the late 1990s. Ultimately, they sold all of their holdings and exited the market. A troika of the Solitsevo Mafia, the Kremlin under Putin, and the current aluminum oligarch Oleg Deripaska forced them out of the country. Deripaska and the Cherny brothers ended up in a series of legal battles, by the way. It's through these legal battles that we discover a number of interesting things, one of them being Trenton Business Corp. This shell company based in Liechtenstein and not New Jersey is considered exceptionally suspicious. The 3 people who could have access to it were Anton Malevetsky, his brother Andrei, and Sam Kislin's nephew, Arik. Some people have suggested that this was an Ishmailovo Common Fund shell company. a place to safely store illicit funds abroad. But we don't have any proof. Mogilevich, Mikhailov, and Deripaska were the winners of the aluminum war in the end. And they're all good friends with Vladimir Putin. Supporting Lebed was probably a mistake. For those of you who don't know Alexander Lebed, he was a charismatic former general and appeared to be capable of beating Putin in 2000, but instead became governor of Krasnoyarsk, the location at the center of the aluminum wars. Even after that, he looked like a potent opponent for Putin in 2004. He could have become the president of Russia rather than him. Lebed died in a mysterious helicopter accident. Whoops. So to get back on track here, Yaponchik is now in jail in the US. In prison, he would sometimes give interviews describing the Russian Mafia as a myth. He said that the criminality flowed from the FSB and the Kremlin, and described Russia as being mired in an unending criminal swamp. I mean, fair. Generally, behind bars, Yaponchik was safe and not engaging in any nefarious activities. However, in 1999, he did find heroin in his cell, so he ended up getting transferred to a more strict yard. However, his fortunes changed soon after. Russia requested the US to deport Yaponchik back to Russia in relation to the incident when he killed 2 Turkish businessmen in Moscow back in 1992. After a legal back and forth, the US agreed and sent him to Russia, where he was both far more powerful but far less safe. This was probably arranged by people in the Kremlin. Yaponchik would have been ID'd back in 1992 if there was any case to nab him for murder. There wasn't. By the time Yaponchik was hauled before the court in 2004, the only Russian witness had passed away and the remaining Turkish businessman refused to return to Russia for the trial. Can't say I blame him. After a few months, Yaponchik was declared not guilty and released. During the trial, Yaponchik reported that he had just wanted to retire and fish. He wanted to become some sort of a problem solver and negotiator inside the Russian Mafia. Behind bars, he'd even picked up writing poetry and children's stories, which he intended to publish alongside an autobiography. No more robberies, no more struggles or shootings, no more extortion, just heading negotiations and handing out judgments like some sort of Russian Mafia judge while writing poems. But that was not to be the case. In 2005, former FSB man turned Putin critic Alexander Litvinenko turned over certain documents to the Spanish police, which resulted in a massive raid, entitled Operation Wasp, freezing over 800 bank accounts, searching 41 businesses and homes, confiscating 42 sports cars and arresting 28 mafia bosses. Among them was Taro Oniani. Now the Russian Mafia was fleeing from Spain, sending the ambitious mob boss, Taro Oniani, back to Moscow, in close proximity of his old enemies, Ded Hassan and Yaponchik. By 2007, even Timoshenko had ended up in Moscow after a long legal struggle in Germany over the murder of F.M. Laskin. Moscow quickly proved a small pond for very big fish. They were rich and had expectations to dominate things back home just as they had abroad. Peace between the old rivals was impossible. While we can't tell exactly what started the conflict, it was likely in relation to Moscow gambling rackets formerly owned by a mob boss who was going through the legal ringer back in Spain. Taro Oniani was on one side, and Ded Hassan was on another. Yaponchik, acting as the oh-so-diplomatic negotiator, sided with Ded Hassan immediately. Oddly, in spite of being Yaponchik's godson, Alexander Timoshenko decided to side openly with Taro Oniani. Why he chose this is unknown, but it did little to win him friends. Yet Hassan and Yaponchik's side put pressure on Taro, and soon violence was erupting between the two factions. In June of 2009, Oniani was arrested in connection with the kidnapping and extortion of a businessman. The first extortion attempt went well, but when Oniani and his men tried double-dipping on the businessman, that's when the law got involved. Oniani was sent to Mostovskaya Chishna in Moscow, famed for its high security and many important prisoners held there. At first, it was hoped that his detention would stop the growing tensions between the different factions. In fact, earlier in 2008, Oniani and his faction had attempted to hold peace talks with Yaponchik and Ded Hassan's people, but they never showed. With Taro behind bars, at least he could be more safe than out on the streets. However, when he arrived at the prison, a note sent by the anti-Taro Oniani thief-in-law faction also arrived at the institution at the same time. It was handed out to the gangsters there. "We inform you, Tariel Onyani is a whore. We, thieves, have made a decision on this whore, currently located at the central Mastroskaya Tishna. If you meet him, act accordingly. May the Lord God keep and protect you." In effect, the letter that was circulated throughout the prison called for Taro to be assassinated behind bars. And they weren't shy about wanting it to happen either, with Yaponchik, Dead Hassan, and numerous other opponents signing the missive before sending it out to the prison. The authorities moved Taro to protective custody for his own safety. At first, it seemed like a major victory for Yaponchik and Dead Hassan. Taro was behind bars, they weren't. The thief-in-law world had largely swung in their favor, with the exception of some Georgian gangsters and Timoshenko. Things seemed good. It was a warm July day when Yaponchik was leaving the high-end Thai Elephant restaurant, no doubt celebrating his win over Taro. There was no doubt that he was in high spirits. As soon as he exited the building, a shot rang out. Yaponchik fell to the ground and was dragged inside. The assassins had used an SVD sniper from inside a modified Gas Gazelle truck, hitting him in the abdomen at about 40 meters away. It was a good shot, but not enough to kill him outright. For several months, Yaponchik hung between life and death, undergoing numerous surgeries to save him. Ultimately, there was nothing that could be done. He passed away October 9th, 2009. It took almost 14 years, but eventually it was found that there were 5 Georgian gangsters behind Yaponchik's assassination. However, the 6th man, the one who organized the attack, was none other than Mongol, the mobster that Yaponchik had issues with back in the 1980s in Tulun prison. Like I said, foreshadowing. Though Yaponchik's successor, one of his few still living godsons, Petrik, was doing well, things on the streets were dangerous for Slavic gangsters and Dead Hassan's people. The attack on Yaponchik did anything but slow the war down. Instead, a series of tit-for-tat attacks happened across Russia. It wasn't on the level of the bloodshed of the early 1990s, but it was an open mafia war on Russia's streets. There were many victims on each side. Dead Hassan was shot by a sniper and was, well, dead. Taro Onyani spent most of the 2010s behind bars and was only released in 2022. Even the thief-in-laws themselves seem to have taken damage from Putin's Russia no longer easily tolerating their antics as they had in the past. One of the few men to escape the war without any scars was Yaponchik's former godson turned enemy, Alexander Timoshenko. But even for a man capable of so much evil like Timoshenko, all of the evil things he had done, all of the betrayal, had clearly begun to wear him down. He was exhausted and almost seemed half dead. When the police detained him briefly in 2013, things went too far, and they demanded that Timoshenko renounce being a thief-in-law and state that he had never even been one. Clearly emotionally distraught and exhausted, Timoshenko complied and the videotape was shared around the thief-in-law community, even ending up on the internet. On June 8th, 2014, just a few days before the 5th year anniversary of the assassination of Yaponchik, Timoshenko went to a church in the Moscow suburbs to pray. A pair of men rode up to him on a motorcycle. He fell back onto a bed of flowers. One of the bullets hit his heart. He was already finished by the time he hit the floor. Despite being so close to a church, he was unable to receive last rites. Likely unaware of who Timoshenko was, the priest of the church had this to say. "He was a good man. The Lord took him. He was probably ready. The Lord takes the ready." Comment, subscribe, like, share the video, and check out my Twitch or YouTube gaming channel. All links are in the description. I hope you guys enjoy the differences in editing and the approach to the video. We'll have to see what the results are. My intent is slightly less intensive editing and longer, more intensive, rather longer and more in-depth videos. Also, just recently, I have started a short series here on YouTube. It's covering every person on the FBI's Most Wanted list, so you can check that out. I'm going to have a link in the description. You can also just check my channel page. Right now it's in testing, so I might not go through with the entire series, or I may change my approach depending on how people respond to it. Check it out if you want. Without further ado, check out this video. It's pretty good. Good stories only. Thank you.